This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast with Living the Wildlife Podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here.
Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. So, hey, glad to have you on board. I hope you, again, always had a great week. Hope you're looking forward to the weekend. I had not too bad of a week, so we'll see how things go. Of course, for the weekend, it's coming up. Glad to have you here. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel. You can reach out. You can check the bell and make sure you subscribe. Make sure you're getting all the latest editions of the Pest Geek Podcast. If you have questions, comments, suggestions for future shows, you can reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear your comments and thoughts about the show. Perhaps you'd have suggestions for future shows or interviews, or perhaps you want to be on the show and shout out to the world some of your own ideas and how things are going. So this week I am wanted to talk about beaver trapping. So kind of going to get a little bit into the weeds here to talk about beaver trapping. So why don't I pull up my PowerPoint here and let's get started with that. So many of you may be involved in some beaver control. Perhaps you haven't been involved in beaver control per se. So this isn't really going to be a presentation on the ins and outs of beaver trapping per se. This is going to be very specific, talking about the Bailey Beaver Trap. Now, I am unusual in the country. I love this trap. Now, I am not suggesting, before you send me all the hate mail, I am not suggesting that this is the end-all and be-all of beaver trapping. I am not suggesting that. I had to use the Bailey Beaver Trap because the foolish state of Massachusetts decided to listen to the animal rights protest industry and vote in a ballot initiative to ban so-called cruel traps. And so that forced me as a wildlife control operator to transition from conibears and footholds to completely caged traps, thanks to the citizens of Massachusetts. I can't blame the legislature per se. I have to blame the citizens because, of course, they listened to the various animal rights protest industry groups and voted. And by a surprising margin, by the way, I think it was a 60-40 vote. So we got definitely trounced without a doubt. But of course, it makes, everyone usually votes for things that they don't think affect them. Well, but anyways, to make a long story short, you can do some literature reading on the fiasco that occurred, and ultimately the legislature had to loosen up on the rules on beaver trapping to allow conibears a little bit easier to access. And so because so many important people started having conflicts with beaver, of course, because the voters didn't want to listen to people like me. So I am not suggesting that cage trapping is the primary means of going. So what I am suggesting, however, is I want to provide a little bit of information on how to use the Bailey Beaver Trap. So if you're in a situation where maybe conibears or footholds are not either desired by your client, or perhaps you as a professional are in a high visibility area and you need to sort of reinforce the mythology in the public that cage traps are somehow safer or more humane than other forms of traps, if you need to do that, and there is certainly some business reasons for that, then this is certainly a trap that you may want to consider. I love this trap for cage traps. And before this time, we didn't have the Comstock traps at this particular time. And so this was one of the traps that was available for us. And they're pricey and they're heavy. So let's talk a little bit about the Bailey Beaver Trap. So perhaps I can convince you to think about it if you ever come across one where someone's selling it, or perhaps you may want to add this to your trap portfolio. How's that for a word? So a lot of you are probably familiar with the Hancock trap. It is certainly among cage traps for beaver, probably the granddaddy and the most used of all those traps. Again, this is all before the Comstock revolution, so to speak, so I want to be sure I'm clear about that. And the benefit of the Hancock trap is that it provided trappers a much easier way of capturing beaver because it had fewer misfires. One of the challenges with the Bailey trap, at least its early version, was that it did suffer from a tremendous amount of misfires, and we'll talk about that here shortly. But the Hancock trap is sort of unusual in the sense that the vertical part stands out of the water, and then the underwater part basically scoops the beaver up and pulls the beaver out of the water. So you have to anchor the trap against a vertical edge. Now, that can be very helpful if you're wanting to lower it down from a bridge, for instance, and so you can chain it, and you can also put it out in the middle of water. The depth of the water is not that critical for the Hancock trap. Certainly you want the lower half underwater, but the beaver, you don't have to have the kind of, you can, if the water's too deep, you just simply attach the trap to some poles and just anchor it that way. And so even if the water is deep, you can still use this particular trap. And you could also use it in a baited type set. You can see the bait there on the back screen. So one moving jaw, capture rate, as you can see there, very, very high. A wonderful trap. I've used it. I don't hate the trap. I do like it, but you know, all these cage traps, of course, there's a lot of metal here. They're very pricey. There's another trap that's on the market, and I'm not going to cover all of them here today, but this is certainly one. I believe this one came out of Canada, if memory serves. This is now the cost of about $600 a piece, and so this one, it's rather heavy, and you basically lay it down on the floor of the water, and the beaver walks into it and hits the back lever, and then it just sort of closes on it. So one moving drive. We don't know what the capture rate is for this particular trap per se. Because again, this came out around 2000, so the research just hasn't been there. And then, of course, the trap that I want to talk about today is the Bailey Beaver Trap, and it costs about $473. Notice the weight, you know, the size on this. These are large traps, and this particular trap is being produced by the Tomahawk Live Trap Corporation. So just in terms of fairness, they do sell one of my books, and I've had a business relationship with them in the past. So, but as you can see at the bottom, this trap does have a very high failure rate, or I should say did have a very high failure rate. And part of the reason for that is that there's two jaws that are moving. So in a sense, it's laying flat and then two jaws come up. So whenever you have two moving parts, you double the ability of misfires that can occur with your particular trap, because perhaps this jaw will come up, or perhaps this jaw will come up and the other one won't. So that can really mess some things up for you. And a lot of people didn't like it. And so I happen to like the trap because it saved me multiple times that beaver didn't get trap wise to it. Where with the Hancock trap, where you have part of the trap out of the water, if you have a misfire with it, or perhaps you're catching a number of beaver, you run the risk of getting some trap-wise beaver to it. Now, there's some ways to address that, to be sure. But with the Hancock trap is completely submerged underwater. So the beaver doesn't see its presence. And so this is what makes what I particularly love about this trap. So there are the parts. You can see the locks that it has. It has to be, you have the trigger wires, you have your base plate, Here the trap is shown in its fired and closed position, just to kind of give you a contrast. There's the set open position. There is the trap in its fired position. And so it comes up not nearly as much with as much force as the Hancock trap. And when the original Hancock trap was produced, it actually had instructions saying you should wear a helmet because it could knock you out. This trap can certainly hurt you, the Bailey trap, but it doesn't come up with anywhere near the amount of force that the Hancock trap would. But again, it doesn't have to because it's not lifting the beaver out of the water. So, which has its advantages and, of course, its disadvantages. So, why did the Baileys fail? Well, as I've already mentioned before, there's just too many moving parts. So, you have 2 jaws, 2 dogs, 2 safeties. And so, you know, you might be laying in bed wondering, oh, did I remove that last safety, right? So, this can be a real problem. You basically double the options for it to fail. So the reasons why this trap failed, number 2, was that it had what's called a jaw failure. And that is where one jaw would fire and the other jaw wouldn't. Because again, you're dealing with 2 dogs and two wires, right? So 2 dogs, 2 jaws, 2 safeties, okay? So here we have one where one dog fired, but the other dog didn't fire. Because there's this spring in the middle, and it pulls the wires off of the dog to let that jaw release. And of course, it doesn't always work that way. So that can be a result of poor adjustments. And of course, the other reason for the misfires is the fact that you have a poor set. The Bailey trap, people thought when they were using this trap that they could put it in a manner that the beaver would just be swimming along and it would catch the beaver sort of in a blind set midstream. It certainly makes sense to think that way. However, the jaws don't move that quickly. And so the beaver would often be outside of the trap zone when it fired the trap. And so it just wouldn't work. You need to have a beaver that's moving slowly over the trap in order to capture it inside of the cage. So how do we make adjustments to this particular trap so it doesn't have the kind of misfires? Well, I'm pleased to tell you that the new traps, and this has been changed for probably at least 10 years by now, is that the locks are already changed. And so when you purchase a new trap, it already has the new locks on it. And so you can see the new lock, how it has an angle bar on it. And the reason for this is that when the trap fires, it doesn't get jammed up like the lower lock you see in the photo. With the original locks, sometimes that lock would not kick up and would instead wedge against the jaw and the beaver would just squeeze out. The newer lock, that's the top lock, has that angle so that even when the jaws close, it kicks the lock up, allowing it to then go over the jaw and then drop back down again, so it doesn't jam. That change alone eliminated probably 3/4 to maybe 90% of all of the misfires that you were having with this particular trap. And so kudos to Tomahawk Supply for making the adjustment on this particular trap for this lock, because once that occurred, a lot of the misfires just went away. Okay, so what this means is if you buy a used trap, you buy a used Bailey, make sure you check the locks, and if you don't have the newer locks, contact Tomahawk Live Trap and get a hold of the new lock, okay? Or build or weld one yourself. Okay. The next adjustment, and I don't know if Tomahawk has done this. Again, they're trying to manufacture these. They're already expensive as they are, and so they're trying to manufacture these quickly because that lowers cost. So I don't know if this adjustment's been made or not. Nevertheless, this is something that you would need to do. And what you would do is you would take the trap, set it, and then see how much wiggle room you have in the wires that go to the dog. What you're looking for is that when that internal spring closes, I'm just trying to point that out. Maybe I'll take my cursor here and see this spring here. What you want is you want this wire and this wire to be pulling equally when that spring fires. So you don't want any lag or extra room in that wire. And the other thing that can happen is that the loop, sometimes the loop, because you create a loop with your wire and then it has some ferrules that are securing it. Sometimes the edge of the wire can get jammed up on the mesh of your cage, and that can also prevent your dog from firing as well. So what you're looking for is to make sure that the wires are just long enough to hold the dogs in place, but no longer, because you want that when that trigger fires, you want everything to be moving as smoothly and evenly as possible. So trim that trigger wire to take any of that slack out. You also want to make sure that the trigger wire is centered in the loop. You can see on the left, this is not good. I call it good, but it's not really good. You want to take that off and then reposition it so that it pulls that loop evenly so it doesn't twist it, because that's one of the problems. It can sometimes rotate it and then the dog won't come out of the loop. It'll make sense once you purchase one. Now, I don't know if, again, Tomahawk Live Trap has done this with their newer versions or not. I don't know. I hope they have. But even if not, again, this would be something that you would want to do with an older trap that you have. Here's an example of where I would talk about how the trigger wire can jam. Remember I said that sometimes when you have those ferrules over the wire to create your loop, that sometimes that edge can hang up on your cage. This is rare, but it can be an issue. So you want to make sure that's trimmed down as much as possible, and also when you're setting it, that it's positioned in a way that it's not going to get hung up on your cage. Okay. Now this sounds like Stephen, boy, you're giving me all these problems with this particular trap. I can assure you that once you start getting familiar with this trap, these are not major issues. And some of these adjustments, once you make the adjustment to the trap, you're done. However, when you are setting the trap, you do need to always consider this wire jam issue. And it's a very easy fix to fix that when you're on site. Another setting issue, and this is another reason why you want the slack in your wire to be removed, and that is you want to be sure that the trigger wire ring and the dog are just connected enough so that it doesn't take much force for the spring to pull that loop off the dog. So when you set this, you don't want any more than 1/4 of an inch holding on to that dog, because again, you need the sensitivity, because this is not a very fast trap. So you want to make sure you eliminate all of the lag time when this trap triggers. And so when you're setting it, make sure that you're not putting it on the dog so aggressively that it's not going to fire in an even fashion. So you want to do that with both arms of the trap. Now, the last area, of course, is you need to be sure that you are setting the trap in the appropriate locations. The Bailey is a wonderful trap, but it's not appropriate in every location. And so I'm going to make sure you understand that you can't use it in a channel set, because people think they're like, oh, I'm going to use this in a channel set. The problem is beavers are moving too fast in the channel set. You have to have the beaver slowing down when he goes over the trap to hit the trigger. If he's moving too quickly, you will not catch the beaver. Thankfully, it's relatively easy to make these types of sets. But if you don't choose them appropriately, you're wasting your time, and then you're going to curse the Bailey, and that's not fair to the trap, because every trap has its advantages and its disadvantages, and we want to make sure we accentuate those advantages and exploit those when using it, because otherwise it's not fair to the device. You can't use the Bailey when the water's freezing, so you have to use it in what's called open water, right? So this is going to be another downside with these particular cage traps. So the first set you want to use is on a beaver dam. So here is an example of a dam. You can see it's kind of flooded in here, but if you look closely, you can see my trap is located here. You'd want to place it on the dam and then create what's called a breach set. Now, you have to be careful of the laws, because some states do not allow you to do any damage or breaching of a dam. What some trappers would do is they would just simply stand on the dam in one little spot and then allow that water to flow over. You don't need a lot of water. You don't want this gushing water. That's not necessary. You don't even need a shovel. What you're trying to do is just create a spot where they're getting a little bit of movement of water to encourage the beaver to inspect that particular spot. And then you're going to lay the beaver trap on the deep water side and then anchor it. Now, if you don't anchor the trap, the beaver will, when he gets caught, will move that trap into deeper water and drown it. Now, you may want that, but if that's the case, then you need to make sure you have a long enough wire so that the trap can be pulled into deep water. If your state doesn't allow you to have it in a drown set, then you need to be sure it's anchored properly so that the trap will not move into any deeper water. Okay, so make sure you check your laws on breaching dams, but here's an example where we're up against a dam and the trap, of course, is fired. So you're basically just simply laying the trap down at the breach with the middle line of the trap in line with the V and perpendicular to that particular opening. You're looking for a steady water flow. It shouldn't be very fast. You don't want a raging torrent there. And I just put it in generally 2 to 3 inches deep, because again, you're going to go down the side of the dam, and so the trigger side is going to be several inches underwater. And then you can also use guide sticks to make sure the beaver is moving into the trap as you want him. Make sure you're using sticks that aren't fresh, otherwise they may use it for food. Okay, so sometimes I would just use old branches to try to force that beaver to move to check out that particular spot. The next set is called the tree and bank set. What you're doing here is you're looking for a tree that a beaver's gnawing on, and then you place the trap directly in front of it underneath the water. You can also place dead sticks and debris at a diagonal. You can see that with the yellow lines. But notice where the arrow is showing you the approach of the beaver to the trap. Now, I have a little bait stick in the back to kind of show you where the beaver is going to be going towards. Now, you can use this in a baited set if you wish, but I would use this as a gnawed tree set. But you could also use it maybe as a caster set or a food lure set. Again, you're just placing it in a manner so that the beaver is moving toward that particular object, but he's slowing down. He's slowing down because he knows he's coming up to the bank. And that's basically how the trap works. Now, an example of the successful gnawed set is there's the tree being gnawed upon, and I just placed the trap in the water below it. So the beaver would come to that location and would climb up onto the bank and then gnaw on the tree. Well, I caught him as he was either going up to the tree or going away from the tree. I don't know which. And the beaver is certainly caught there. I hope you're understanding that the beauty of this particular trap, because it's submerged, there's no fear on the beaver's part. So if you're having a situation where maybe you've made some mistakes and now you have an educated beaver, the fact that the Bailey trap is being used in locations where a beaver is automatically already going, you have this wonderful opportunity to capture that quote-unquote trap-wise or lure-wise beaver. Now, despite all the benefits of the Bailey trap, I do want to talk about one of the disadvantages, and that is the Bailey does hold the beaver in water. To kind of show you that previous slide, notice the beaver is still in the trap, and this is cold water. So the beavers actually in the wintertime suffer hypothermia. Now that's hard for us to imagine, but beavers just don't sit in water, in cold water. So this can be a problem. Beavers can suffer hypothermia. So if you're not required to check your traps on a regular basis, on a daily basis, you could have a situation where your beaver actually freezes to death. So definitely keep that in mind. Now, on the flip side, for those of us in wildlife control, where we're often trapping beavers out of season, a Bailey trap is actually better in the summertime because it keeps the beaver from overheating because the beaver has access to water, where the Hancock trap pulls the beaver out of the water, which is better in the wintertime to keep the beaver from getting hypothermia. In the summertime, it actually is bad because it takes the beaver out of the water and so therefore prevents the beaver from getting cool. So again, the different traps offer you different advantages for the beaver's humaneness, for humaneness capture of the beaver, depending on the time of year. So Baileys are more humane in the summertime, less humane in the winter. Hancocks are less humane in the summer, more humane in the winter. So definitely keep this in mind. This is why I think it's important as professionals we don't fall into the trap of thinking so-called live traps. I hate, those of you who listen to my podcast know, I hate that phrase because it's so vague and unprofessional, because footholds are live traps, right? So cage traps can be more humane depending on how they're used and the target animal that they're going after. But they're not always more humane than the other traditional traps such as footholds or conibears. It depends. And so definitely keep that in mind. Well, I hope that this is giving you some, if not even some interest perhaps, in if you ever come across a Bailey trap, that you don't just simply poo-poo it. Perhaps you would add that trap to your portfolio. Those of you that may have Bailey traps in your portfolio, perhaps want to consider using the device. Just a word of caution that these traps are pretty devastating on, cranes or something. So if you have a crane that hits that trigger and he's inside those jaws, it will mangle him up. Again, another indication that cage traps are not always more humane to non-target wildlife as other forms of traps, right? So definitely keep that in mind. So I'm not trying to bash the Bailey, but I want to give you the good, the bad, and the ugly on all the pieces of equipment that we use. But I do love the Bailey trap. I have a lot of fond memories of the particular device. They are expensive, so if you are using them with a client, make sure you get some sort of a deposit or in your contract that you're going to get paid if that trap walks away. And so you want to be sure that if you can even chain it down, that can be helpful as well. So I would not be using it in locations unless I had pretty good assurance that the trap will be there when I come back and check it. So it's because it's a lot of money. But, well, you've been listening to Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. We've been talking about Bailey Beaver traps, and I hope you get as excited about the trap as I am. Even if you're not looking to use it, perhaps you're not required to use it in your particular state, well, that's a good thing. However, should you be in a situation where you perhaps want to be considering using cage traps for whatever reason that's in your business or perhaps for client preference, I hope this has given you some techniques to use the Bailey trap appropriately and effectively, because I do think it's a remarkable trap, and I really loved using it under the circumstances that I was involved in. Do definitely reach out to me if you would at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts. And again, you've been listening to Living the Wildlife. Why? Because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everyone.